Right, hello, and welcome to another Dauntless Development video. Today we're going to be looking at another tutorial for C#, and we're going to be covering functions. Now, functions we've used before, we've seen, without necessarily knowing, we've seen this main. Now every program starts with a main function and ends with a main function. So between these curly braces, if the code is not inside these curly braces, it won't run. That's just how it works, and that's how it works in other programming languages as well. So you always have to have this main function. That's just where it begins and ends. Now, what we can do is we can create other functions with other names. They hold other bits of code. Now, this is useful for a lot of things. So instead of having all the code written out inside the main function, we can have all the code written out in different functions, and then all we need to write is the function name. So say we have a function called function A. Instead of writing all the code every time that's in function A, we can just write function A and it will run all that code. Now, if you're lost, don't worry. We're going to start working on it now, and it should be pretty clear once we start moving. So, we're going to start off by just doing something without functions, something we've done before. So we're going to just say, and now we're not doing anything that necessarily requires functions. I mean, technically nothing requires functions, but we're going to just do some very simple things just to get the point across. So we're going to just say, declare an int called A, and we're going to just say int A equals 0. In fact, no, we'll say 2 just because, so it has an effect. And we'll declare another int called B, which is 3. And what we can do is we can just say int C equals A times B, and console dot writeline C. So what we've done here is something we've done pretty much the same before. We've just taken two integers, multiplied them together, and then wrote that out to the console. Now that's not complicated. We've done this before. It's very simple. So we don't necessarily need to make this simplified any further, but just to keep things simple whilst we use functions, we're going to use this as an example. So what we can do is we can do this with a function instead. So you can see here that, I mean, technically this is about 4 lines of code we've got here to do this thing. Now we could shrink it down a bit. We could maybe not get rid of this line. But what we can do is we can make a function. So we can make void, and we'll call it multiply. Now, as I said, this doesn't matter. We want it to be an int, actually. So this here is what is known as the return type. Now that's the kind of information that comes back whenever you type this function out. So you can kind of treat this a bit like a variable in that you could say A equals multiply, and then that would return an int because this is a return type of int. So it's kind of like the answer to the question. It's like you're asking the function you're giving the function some information and asking for the result. So what the information we give it are called input variables. So we're going to say int A and int B. So whenever we call this function, we need to provide it with 2 integers, which are A and B. And what we can do is we can say int C equals A times B, and then we can say return C. So you can see the similarities here. We've got a variable called A, a variable called B. So it's just, I mean, obviously the variable names can be whatever you want them to be. They don't have to be these. This is just for simplicity's sake. And then we have C, which is equal to A times B, and then we return C here. So what we can do is, instead of having this code here, which I'll just run it now, just to show that it will be the same. It's taking a little while. Oops, static. Yeah. Okay, so you can see that returns 6. So 2 times 3 is 6. What we can do is I'll just make this static as well. So all static means is that nothing's going to change in here outside. It's quite... I'll explain this more in detail later, but a static function is... It can be called... There's only one of them. There's only going to be one of that function. So you're not going to have multiple copies of a multiply. You're just going to have the same multiply function, but you're just going to put different things in. You're just going to get an answer back. So it's not going to store anything different. So what we can do is we can say, instead of this console.writeline C here, we can just say console.writeline multiply A B. And then, yeah, and then we need a closing bracket here. So what this does is this, instead of typing C here, instead of having to have this code, we can just have it appear like it's all in one line. Now, we've effectively, oops, I've realized that we do actually need to input those variables. So int A equals 2 and int B equals 3. But you can imagine you could take this as an input. And obviously, if you had a lot more inputs, it would be a lot tidier to do this. But as I said, this is a poor example of it because it's a very simple thing to do to begin with. But you can see that here we can replace the code that we had with just the word multiply. And this could be any amount of code. This could be a few hundred lines of code if you want. It could be thousands of lines of code, and you could just have it all under one function name. So then when we run it, it returns the exact same result, which is quite useful. Now, we can have functions that call other functions. We can have functions that call themselves. And we can use functions to do a lot of things. So kind of a way of thinking of the structure of them is it's like having a task. So a function is kind of a task. So you give it information. So this is kind of the you provide it with information. You ask it to perform a task to that information, and then it comes back to you with an answer after it's finished that task. Now, if the return type is void, like it is in the main, then it doesn't give an answer back. It just does the task, and then it doesn't respond, basically. So, because what we can do, just in case I didn't make it clear, is we could declare an int C here, and we could call that multiply, if I can hit the right keys, multiply A times B. So we can actually declare that and store that as a variable if we want. So you can have functions that store variables, which can be very useful when you're making, like the calculator, which we made at one point. If you were to make like a scientific calculator, for example, you might having functions can be very beneficial for that. So maybe a better example of a function that we might want to use is we could have int, and then we could say square, and then we just have an int A, and then int. And we don't even need to declare a variable type. We can just say A times A. So that just returns the square of that. Now, that way, instead of writing A times A, we can just say int D equals square of A, for example. So you can see that's a little bit better than writing out the calculation, because you could also have say cosine. You could do different things. You could have you could figure out the hypotenuse of a triangle. You could do all sorts of functions where you could hide a lot of code inside the function and just use the function name. Now you'll see this a lot as we move on. We'll be using functions a lot. I mean, this console.writeline is a function that does a lot of things behind the scenes. We might actually be able to, I'm just going to see, can we? Yeah. So you can see that writeline, I'll go to the code rather than just peeking it. So this is behind the scenes kind of thing in C# within the system library. So writeline has a bunch of functions. There's a lot of variations, and we'll cover this at one point, but this is quite advanced. But you can see all this kind of code that exists behind the writeline name, and all we do is we write writeline. So you can have a lot of code in then, and then just this tiny little one word, or I guess it's technically 2 words, just to kind of summarize it, which means that your main function doesn't become extremely cluttered. So what kind of a good thing about this is you can write your functions, as long as your function names are very clear, your code can kind of be readable to somebody who doesn't know how to program. So if you go from the main function, you could find out that you start off by multiplying 2 numbers, and it's written in plain English that you're multiplying. You then square them, you then do something else, and it goes on. It makes the code a lot more easy to read. It makes finding out where problems are a lot easier, because if you've written it in plain English, then it's something that's more natural for you to pick up on if you've done something wrong. And trust me, bugs are not a rarity. You will find bugs all the time. Most of a programmer's time is spent fixing bugs, I think, because not things working first time, when you get to complicated things anyway, is uncommon. But yeah, so that was just a brief look at functions. They're not particularly complicated, but they can be used for a wide array of things, basically anything. You can use functions for anything. So yeah, that's all for today. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.